So the whole thing about what it is to be human is shared by all the great religions, and they each have a different perspective on it. And that for me is the key issue. It's something about shared value, but more than that, it's something about shared humanity and a shared perspective. Now, as we got into more and more dialogue, it became clear that shared perspective did mirror certain shared values, but not every one of them. And what was so interesting about working with the Hizmet Movement was that they were open to the dialogue even around the differences, what might seem to be insurmountable differences. Views of homosexuality, for instance, views about alcohol. And I can remember a session we had in Istanbul. It was a 3-day conversation. And some of these issues were raised, and it was a great conversation. And we were able to say, okay, the differences remain, but I do not therefore speak to you as a Hizmet person or wish to characterize you as racist, homophobic, or whatever the terms might often be. It was something about, it's still something about the way in which the dialogue that we began to develop with the Hizmet Movement was about who we were, and the worth of the humanity in that conversation. It strengthened my sense of commitment to the other, and if I give you a personal illustration here, I was born in West Yorkshire, in a small village, and I'm the product of a mixed marriage. I come from a little village called Harden, and that's where my mother came from, and my father came from a village called Cullingworth, which was 3 miles away from Harden. And that, in that situation, was thought to be a mixed marriage. How can you possibly marry someone from Cullingworth? And so one thing that I've learned forcefully in the last 14 years with the dialogue is that those attitudes have not gone in me. They're still there in the reptilian brain. And they're still a part of me. I haven't suddenly become a saint who is, does everything properly, or right, or whatever. And one of the glorious things about dialogue with the Hizmet Movement is that reptilian brain has been challenged. I've had to begin to address, interrogate, not begin, continue to address and interrogate that reptilian brain, which looks at the other as a competitor, looks at the other as a threat, as a danger. What I'm saying is that the work with the Gülen movement and with the members of the Gülen movement has reinforced that internal dialogue for me and the external dialogue, and made it more and more real, because it's forcing me to look more and more at the little boy from Harden who saw the world in a very different way. For me, the Blue Marmara was fascinating because, to begin with, many of the people who were involved in that experience did have a strong sense of shared values. It was important to break the Israeli blockade. It was important to make a statement about justice. So there seemed to be a very real shared notion of justice. And then comes Gülen's response, which perhaps it's, the context is difficult because it wasn't a fully thought through press release, but the response is quite different. It doesn't begin by recognizing these shared values. It actually says something about, well, let's think about what did happen. Let's think about some of the important principles that were that ought to be involved there. It was a really important statement, which I would agree with, and indeed the later reports that came out, the official reports, agreed with that situation. But it was a shock to both members of the movement and to the Turkish government. Now, there are a whole bunch of questions which I can't answer here. Did he fulfill a leadership responsibility? Was he thoroughly aware of the consequences of some of the things that he said? Especially when you have grieving families and a reinforcing of that with the political response. Or was it absolutely right because a leader, in one sense, ought to provide us with a different perspective, and then we've got to work out how that pans out. So it raises huge questions about the responsibility and role of Gülen as a leader. What I wanted to argue in various places is that actually he's developed that in the time since then. We could argue that in a sense that's led to levels of dialogue within the movement which wouldn't have been there had there not been this challenge. But also I think he's developed as a leader with some of the pronouncements that he's made. So in 2015 in the New York Times article, very measured, very carefully thought through, focusing on justice and many different ideas. But then that raises a question: is he a leader? And in one sense, he would deny that. It is not my movement. And how can you lead a movement? I'm a Christian, and I know that Jesus never had an institution to lead. He gave Peter, who was probably the worst qualified person, the job to develop an institution. On you I build my church, the rock. But that's why I think Gülen is so wise. Recently I said to him, how will you see the future of your movement? What planning do you have in place? And this was an implied question. There was an implication here. Have you got succession planning? And what does that mean? And he, with great wisdom, he said, no, the movement will develop. But the important point is that it will only do so if it stays focused on the core practices. He didn't even talk about principles, which I think is rather interesting. So the core practices of education, the core practices of anti-poverty, and the core notion of peace building. That's the character of the movement. As a Christian, I know that Jesus said, "By your fruits ye shall know them," and I think that's exactly where Gülen is, which is a delightful thought, because that then challenges me as someone who tries to write about leadership ethics, to think again about what a leader is. Yeah, I mean, in the business world where I often work, we have long, complex succession plans, and who will come in and how will we bring them in? Who's the best person for it? I go back to the point that a movement is hard to define. Because a movement has no no definition to it. It's got a character and it will develop, but it's hard to define. So what you would expect within a movement is very different attitudes towards the person who is their founder or might be characterized by some as their leader. And that was again, forgive me giving you a personal example. In the recent meeting with him, it was fascinating. The dynamic was utterly fascinating. In a big room, we had possibly 20 of his followers who were kneeling. Now, that was partially because there weren't enough seats. But their stance, as it were, felt like adoration. Yeah, and that's fine. That's fine. And then there was a very interesting woman from Vienna who wanted to talk about some of the things that were going on, and she was a very different dynamic. This was not adoration. This was. This was about identity. This was about, what we're doing in Vienna, and yeah. And then you had these two elderly blokes from the UK who were just trying to get into some conversation, and to share some ideas and so forth, which was much more of a mutual thing. Yeah. Now all three were going on. Now, I think that's what's going on within the movement, that there are lots of folks who have a particular view of leadership, and who are happy to see him. I think it's very important not to use the word as a cultic leader, because a cultic leader that's a very particular thing where a cult is ruled by somebody who suggests that all truth comes through them, which of course God's not. Nonetheless, it's possible to see something of this quasi-religious approach there, but at the same time there are people discussing and arguing. And when I was in Amsterdam last autumn, we were discussing with the movement there, and it was a very different atmosphere. It was a mutual. It was a dialogue. It was about a group who were very aware of their plural identity. They were Dutch. They were also part of the civil society of Holland, and so their dialogue that they had as part of the movement was also evidenced in the dialogue that they had with the government of Holland, where they've had 3 reports into whether they were cultic or not. All of them giving them a clean bill of health, which is nice and wonderful. But actually from there on, you move into dialogue about what does it mean to be accountable in civil society in Holland. And they had so much right to be in that because they had been called to account on at least 3 occasions. Now, that's a richness there. How do you capture all that? How do you describe all that? The Christian Church has been at this game for a long time, and it's gone into the institutional, into the power, and become blind, and then it's steered back into the core purpose of what we've been about, and it will always happen. It will always happen. Which is why we should never want to look at the movement as something which is unambiguous. Every movement is ambiguous. That's okay. Ambiguity. And I think that Gülen has an appreciation of ambiguity, not least because he's focused on difference. Let me start with the second question first. I think, yes, of course it has a future in the West. I think that's where the future of the movement lies, as a global movement. So not just the West. You begin to ask questions about how it might move to other places. But in the West, I think, yes, it has a future in the West. Much of its identity in the West, I suspect, has been focused in what Ian Markham calls location. Okay, telling everybody this is who we are, and we're located here, and this is what we want to do and can do. Okay? And following that, good community work, building up relationships in the local community, which is fantastic, and that's great. I suspect that in order to maintain, yes, I mean no movement like Hizmet, I would argue, can continue in that particular way. Partially because there are social and political issues which are continuously coming up. The growth of the development and the continuity of the movement, it seems to me, will be in the way in which it continues to speak in public about all of these issues. Certainly done some great work around the whole notion of radicalization, but more, I mean, one of the great things for me is that those three things, those three purposes I mentioned before, you could virtually say those are exactly what was happening in the UK in 1944-48 with the beginnings of the welfare state, or what Titmuss would have called, what he did call, the welfare society, which becomes really interesting then. I think the Hizmet movement has a fantastic contribution to make to that debate. Right now, we're looking at the National Health Service. Whose responsibility is health? Well, okay, what's the Islamic perspective on that? Who should respond? Well, what's the, now, that, of course, raises the question of politics, and obviously this is not a political movement, and Gülen is quite right. It shouldn't become associated with a political movement. But politics is about how we, as a group together, as a nation together, begin to develop ideas and values and worth and so forth. I think the movement has a real place in that. Now, the question is how might that be developed? I think public conversation, public dialogue is where things should be going, so that people can not just the people who think that the same way can hear what the ideas of the movement are and what the practice of the movement is. It's interesting. I mean, I have to say it didn't affect my perception of the movement. That's to say, I still believed the movement, and largely because of the friendships that have been developed. For me, there are elements here of persecution, which ring bells with the Christian experience. And there's a truth that no persecution is pure. There's always political reasons, why it happens, and different narratives, as it were. So in one sense, I see the movement's experience, the massive experience of persecution. I see this as not just Turkish, but global. Now, one of the things that's been really impressive in the response since then is the way in which the movement has not taken to arms. But what an example the movement has given. Here comes an anti-democratic response to them, and it's clear because it's against the rule of law. It focuses in one person, etc. And the response has been extraordinary. What we see instead of an aggressive reaction is studied, thoughtful, wise, patient, heard. Yes. Now that's extraordinary. And part of the problem is of course, that in the context of this response, there isn't room for dialogue. Because the anti-democratic is precisely saying, we don't want to talk to you. Life is like this. But the point is that this raises a whole number of questions about the way in which government, East and West, is going. And this is part of the reason why I want to say that the movement has a massive potential for getting into that conversation. Precisely because it can say, it's much like the Christian and Jewish notion of turning the other cheek. That's what the movement has exemplified. The question now for me is, can it turn the sense of bereavement that it must have personally and as Turks, can it turn that into the kind of continued public conversation? I think the movement's been through an enormous amount and will continue to go through that, and nobody can say how or when it will change. As a theologian, I want you guys to develop a theology of hope, alongside a theology of lament, the Old Testament lament. But that's where they were. We are in Babylon. How, where will we go? How can we go? God, where are you? The Jews in the Holocaust. Where can we go? How? Yeah. Theologically, I think you can begin in practice and in ideas to demonstrate both a politics of hope and a theology of hope. Much of my recent attempt to make sense of responsibility has been in the business world, and it's focused on integrity, and I argue that integrity is the real definition of it. Forgive me, not that the most authentic definition of integrity is about the practice of responsibility. It's about accountability, genuine accountability. It's about genuine agency, knowing what I think and feel, and knowing what I see as worth, and knowing and being responsible for my view of the world. Most people are not responsible, do not hold themselves responsible for their view of the world. They just take, what they're working with. but also integrity is about practice, is about possibilities, is about the moral imagination. How do we? It's not either or. What are the possibilities? And I want to argue that you practice that responsibility through narrative and dialogue. That's how it is. You develop your own narrative, which is a constant reworking. Some folks talk of it as rewriting the self, and dialogue, internal and external, is the example of this. And once you look at the question of education, that's where it is. Education is dialogue. Learning is dialogue. Learning as developing narrative. It's the same with peace building and conflict resolution. Developing the places of dialogue, the places of safety where that can work. So what I want to suggest is that it's precisely in those practicing those ways that the movement, I think, will make the contributions and develop the idea of hope. Psychologists, at least some, suggest that hope is a practice, not a virtue, and that it's about developing pathways and goals, and it's not just that, because hope needs to be needs to be a sense of worth. When I was at school, one of my best mates was the worst person in the class, and the teacher used to say, "You are hopeless. You are hopeless." Now, I think the more that the movement can articulate and share its narrative, and the very particular narratives of the school building and what's going on within the schools and within education, showing how it is developing agency, how it is developing responsibility, how it is developing imagination. But the important thing is where that goes and who is listening. So I think it will be fantastic to move some of that as an academic into the Association of Moral Development, and they have a great community and a great learning and a great journal. They need to hear that. The more they hear it, the more that will move out into general education bloodstream. Is there a contribution from the Gülen movement to any white papers that are emerging from the government about education, higher and secondary? So interdisciplinary, cross-professional, but also political, entering into those spheres, and that's a remarkable. That would be a remarkable sight, because most people. I mean, when we were talking in Brussels, a round table, there were 2 politicians there and 4 advisors to politicians in the European Union. And they clearly thought that the movement was just sort of cowering in a corner. And the big question was, were they really terrorists or not? Yeah, but when the conversation moves into all these positive things, that was a totally different perspective. But they only got that from a conversation that was occurring around politics, around where their neck of the woods was. Yeah. So I would suggest that that's where it should go. That's moving forward. Not developing further conferences about Gülen, but going to all kinds of other conferences about education and so forth and so on. More and more dialogue. seems to me. But you had a very particular thing when you said the responsibility of the persecuted. That becomes really interesting. Because if that dialogue is done successfully, that's what will be seen. That here is a persecuted group who is talking about hope, who is focused on these core practices. I'm honestly thinking that. I think increasingly, this goes back to my previous answer, increasingly I thought, because at one point there was a Gülen industry for academics, and it seemed like the whole world was coming together to learn about Gülen. I think that would have been good for 2 years, but for 7 or 8 years, and that felt a little bit like location, as I mentioned before. This is who we are. We want to assure you that we're okay. But many of the academics there were part of the role of an academic is that you have to write papers and that has to go into places, So the focus wasn't. It was sometimes, but very often not on practice, not on ground sharing, as it were. So I think it's responsibility of the outsider, and I'm speaking as an outsider, is to stay with the movement and to continue conversation secondly, there's a responsibility to care, because you guys are going through a real sense of bereavement. It's manifestly, individually, professionally. For you, it must be as a journalist, as a family man. There's huge. So I think we have a responsibility to care. I think we've all, thirdly, have a responsibility to raise the issues and to broaden the conversation. I'm not sure, as the advisors, I'm not sure how far we're doing that or how well we're doing that. And I wonder if, I've talked to bishops and so forth and so on, and I believe that the Archbishop of Canterbury is or has been in conversation with Erdogan. Now, I've got to catch up on that and see what the basis of that was. But it may be that the advisors need to meet outside the conversations with the Dialogue Society. It may need that we need to think more about strategy ourselves and how we can raise those issues. But I think it partly also. You can see how academics, for instance, as outsiders, could raise these issues professionally within their own discussions. The responsibility, I think, keeps coming back to dialogue. With you guys, with each other, with whoever is prepared to. With the groups within which we operate and find our identity.